Between 2002 and 2003, a quiet, entirely unremarkable young man drifted from town to town in some of the poorest parts of post-Soviet Russia. He blended into the background wherever he went. There was nothing remarkable about him at all. No distinctive voice, no strong presence, nothing that lingered in memory. He was the kind of person you could sit next to on a bus, stand behind in line, or see on the street and forget instantly. But hidden behind the face of a nobody, there was a killer who struck at the most defenseless members of society. Over the course of 1 year, Denis Pishikov murdered at least 14 elderly men and women. The press would later call him the Ural Raskolnikov, a reference to Dostoevsky's infamous murderer. In July 2004, the Moscow Regional Court sentenced him to life imprisonment for those crimes. And in 2025, he confessed to 3 more murders, bringing his total number of victims to 17. Denis Pishikov was born on April 12, 1983, in the mining settlement of Bulanash in the Sverdlovsk region. He was the second child in the family. His older sister, born in 1978, would serve time in prison for theft. For a time, Denis's childhood was described as happy, but in 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, tragedy struck. His father, Sergei Pishikov, lost his job and soon died of a heart attack. The family's survival now depended entirely on his mother, Lyubov Ivanovna, who worked at the local radio plant. She later remarried a locomotive driver, Alexander Anushin. But instead of stability, Denis gained an alcoholic stepfather who showed no interest in raising him or his sister. Denis struggled in school, repeating grades twice before dropping out after the 5th year. He became a regular at the juvenile police department for theft and hooliganism. Outwardly, however, he appeared timid and modest, a disguise that would later help him avoid suspicion. His grandmother tried to discipline him harshly, at times even locking him in the basement for misbehavior. Meanwhile, his sister slipped deeper into petty crime, leaving Denis increasingly isolated. By his teenage years, the foundation of what would become a violent future had been laid: poverty, neglect, and early criminal behavior. In the summer of 2000, Denis Pishikov left his hometown in the Urals and boarded a train for Moscow. He was just 17, quiet, pale, and unremarkable. Like many who came to the capital after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he seemed to be chasing opportunity, perhaps a chance to escape the poverty of the provinces. But Moscow at the turn of the millennium was a city of contrasts. Shiny new billboards and fast food restaurants stood beside crumbling Soviet apartment blocks. Wealthy businessmen drove foreign cars, while millions of ordinary Russians struggled to survive on pensions and wages that barely covered bread and utilities. For those without education or connections, survival often meant turning to the shadow economy, or to crime. Denis slipped easily into that shadow. That autumn, he was caught stealing a car radio. Yet he had a peculiar advantage. He looked harmless. Thin, modest, almost shy, he didn't fit anyone's image of a criminal. The police believed his act, released him on his own recognizance, and Denis simply vanished. He was placed on the federal wanted list, but in those chaotic years, with overworked police and widespread corruption, he was simply not a priority, so no one searched too hard for a him. By the end of the year, Denis had disappeared into the Vladimir region, where life moved more slowly, wages were even lower, and hope was scarce. In the town of Karabanovo, he found a girlfriend and moved into her apartment. To her, he played the role of a provider. He said he worked construction jobs or at a tire shop, yet he never held those jobs for long, and somehow money always found its way into his pockets. She never asked questions. But the truth was that Denis was not bringing home wages. The money came from theft, and soon it would start coming from the homes of murdered pensioners. On March 29th, in the village of Pashnevo, in the Orikovo-Zuevsky district, he forced his way into the home of pensioner Alexander Lebedev. Inside the small wooden house, the old man confronted him. Denis struck him with brutal force and killed him where he stood. From the pockets of the dead man, he took 3,000 rubles, barely $100 at the time. It was his first known killing. Just days later, in April, he committed an even more savage crime. In the town of Alexandrov, he broke into a modest home by smashing the glass of a veranda window. An elderly married couple lived there, frail and defenseless. Dennis attacked them both with an axe and finished the job with a knife. He dragged their bodies into the cellar to cover them in darkness before rifling through the house. From all this violence, he took almost nothing, about $20 worth of cash, a little food, and a rubber boat. That summer, in Kurtzak, he broke into another pensioner's house, this time an 83-year-old woman. She too was beaten and killed, but her home held no valuables, and Dennis left with nothing but another life taken. By the end of 2002, his pattern was unmistakable. On November 9th, in the village of Potocino, he entered the home of 80-year-old Minibador Mingaliva. He struck her down with an axe and left the weapon lying near her body. Her son later told police that just days before, she had welcomed a strange young man into the house and given him tea. From her savings, Dennis took less than $20 in rubles and an old wristwatch. Nothing else. The killings were savage, but the rewards were pitiful. Again and again, he used crude, heavy tools. Axes, knives, and whatever he could find inside the victims' own homes. Investigators would later conclude that Denis Pishikov was never really robbing. He was hunting the old and the defenseless. In 2003, the pace of Denis Pishikov's killings accelerated. On January 17th, he murdered 68-year-old Nina Melikina in her home in the Vladimir region. Weeks later, he killed Vera Velikanova by striking her with an axe, before stealing a handful of rubles. In March, he strangled Daria Korovina in Patushki, left Alexandra Fomina's dead body locked inside her house for nearly 2 weeks before she was discovered and killed Anastasia Kozlova on International Women's Day. By the end of March, he had taken at least 6 more lives, sometimes killing 2 victims in a single day. The pattern was always the same: break into a home, use whatever weapon was at hand, strike swiftly, take a small sum of money or food, and disappear. What stood out to investigators was not what he stole, but how little he cared about it. His gains were pitiful, sometimes nothing at all. And yet he risked everything, again and again. He was not a robber who killed to cover his tracks. He was a killer first, and theft was secondary. His crimes were not driven by greed, but by compulsion. To neighbors and acquaintances, he had always seemed quiet, but investigators would later describe him as detached, unemotional, and disturbingly casual when speaking about the murders. He remembered every detail: the rooms, the furniture, the faces of his victims. And yet he showed no remorse. Denis Pishikov was, in many ways, the perfect predator, not because he was clever or powerful, but because he was invisible, ordinary, forgettable, and driven not by need, but by the simple urge to kill. By the spring of 2003, Denis Pishikov was killing almost without pause. On March 31st, he murdered 2 elderly women in the village of Korovino, one after the other, taking little more than a few banknotes. The very next day, on April 1st, he strangled 83-year-old Pelageya Gusarova in Likino Duliovo. And on April 3rd, he attacked Sergei Vlasov and his daughter Marina in the village of Voinovo Gora. Sergei was killed, Marina survived her injuries. The murders had become reckless as he escalated. Investigators would later say it was as if he needed to kill more often, almost like an addiction. But this compulsion was also his undoing. He was no longer careful. He returned again and again to the same districts, often in broad daylight, walking through villages where police had already warned the elderly to stay alert. On April 5th, 2003, his luck ran out. In the town of Likino Duliovo, a pensioner named Lydia Ivanovna Kozlova noticed a young man wandering the streets, peering into yards. He matched the description of the killer that had been circulating in the area. At her own risk, she followed him and alerted police. Moments later, officers confronted Denis on a deserted street. He carried gloves, a screwdriver, and a stolen watch from one of his victims. He did not resist. And as he was led away, he immediately began to confess. 14 murders in total. He spoke about them with no emotion, like he was describing ordinary events, not human lives. After just over a year of killings, this otherwise wholly forgettable young man who had terrorized 2 regions was finally behind bars. In the months after his arrest, investigators pieced together the full scale of Denis Pishikov's crimes. At first, he admitted to 8 murders, but during questioning, the number grew: 14 lives in total, taken in little more than a year. Pishikov described every murder with clinical precision. He recalled furniture arrangements, the faces of victims, even the amounts of money he had stolen. His memory was flawless. There was no sign of guilt or remorse. Psychiatrists declared him sane. He knew what he was doing, and he knew it was wrong. Yet he could not or would not explain why he had chosen to kill. On July 8, 2004, the Moscow Regional Court sentenced him to life imprisonment. In his petition for clemency, Dennis wrote, "Have pity on me." Anything but life imprisonment. The Russian Supreme Court rejected his plea. He was transferred to the Ural region, to the notorious White Swan Penal Colony in Solikamsk, a prison built for the most dangerous men in Russia. He spent his days under the strictest regime with long hours locked in his cell, constant surveillance, and limited contact with other inmates. The White Swan was known for breaking the will of its prisoners and forcing them into silence and routine. Those who encountered him behind bars described him as quiet and withdrawn, rarely speaking and never showing remorse. Unlike the powerful crime bosses housed in the same prison, Pishikov had no influence and no authority. What he had was only a monotonous existence that stretched endlessly ahead. After more than 20 years of this, during an interrogation in March 2025, Pishikov confessed to 3 more murders that had remained unsolved for more than 2 decades. The first was in April 2002 in the town of Alexandrov. An elderly married couple was beaten to death with an axe and knife. Their bodies were hidden in the cellar, and from their home, Dennis took almost nothing: a few rubles, some food, and a rubber boat. The second was that same summer in Kurzhach, where he killed an 83-year-old woman. Her house contained nothing of value, and he left empty-handed. With these confessions, his total number of victims rose to 17, but investigators questioned his motives. Why confess now? Some suggested it was not remorse, but calculation. By admitting to old crimes, Pishikov would be escorted out of prison for investigative experiments, which would give him a brief change of environment, a break from the unchanging walls of the White Swan. Whatever the reason, his words added 3 more names to the long list of the elderly men and women who had fallen victim to a remorseless predator. Outwardly, he was unremarkable, quiet, timid, and almost invisible. But his crimes revealed a very different profile. Forensic psychologists described his behavior as consistent with antisocial personality disorder. He demonstrated a profound lack of empathy, an inability to feel guilt, and a tendency to exploit others without remorse. In his interrogations, he spoke about murder in a flat and unemotional tone, displaying what experts call emotional blunting. His choice of elderly and isolated pensioners as victims reflected a pattern of target selection based on vulnerability. He avoided risk and sought out those who were least capable of resistance. This suggests instrumental violence, where murder was a means to an end. Yet the negligible financial gain indicated that money was never the true motive. Instead, investigators concluded that his killings were compulsive. The short intervals between murders in 2003 stem from a cycle of tension, release, and relief, similar to patterns seen in other serial offenders. Every killing provided temporary psychological gratification, followed by the urge to kill again. Criminal profilers noted his ability to blend into society. His low arousal presentation, modest, shy, forgettable, functioned as a mask that allowed him to approach strangers without suspicion. This capacity for concealment is often described as a form of subclinical psychopathy, where manipulativeness and superficial charm traits are present, but less exaggerated than in classical psychopaths. Ultimately, Denis Pishikov was a man who appeared harmless, yet possessed the psychological architecture of a predator: emotionally detached, compulsively violent, and entirely without remorse. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. See you next time.